Captain Ilara Voss leaned over the holographic console of the Endurance, her fingers brushing the flickering projections as she examined the distress signal. It was faint, barely a whisper in the vast emptiness of space. The signal had been detected in a remote sector, an area once abandoned after the end of the Broken War, a conflict that had scared the galaxy beyond recognition. Ilara had been briefed on the mission, a routine search and rescue operation for a missing vessel. But something about this signal felt different. There was a desperation in its tone that she couldn't ignore. "Captain, you've got to see this," Lieutenant Marcus Hale called from his station, his voice tinged with unease. Ilara moved swiftly to his side, her boots making quiet thuds against the metal floor of the command deck. On the screen, the signal flashed again, growing stronger as they drew closer. The coordinates were located near an old battlefield, one marked in the archives as Iridian Crater, a place where humanity's last major push against the alien coalition had failed. The war had ended soon after, and this sector had been abandoned. No one had ever expected to find anything here, let alone a distress signal. "What's the source of the transmission?" Ilara asked, narrowing her eyes. "It's coming from an old relay station," Marcus replied, his voice laced with uncertainty. "It shouldn't even be active anymore." "Is it a ghost transmission?" Ilara pressed, her voice colder now. Ghost transmissions were rare but not impossible, a wayward signal from an ancient battle, left echoing through time. But this one was different. It was too deliberate. "I don't think so," Marcus said, his fingers dancing over the controls. "It's human. At least it sounds like it." Ilara's pulse quickened. A human signal from a dead sector. The implications were staggering. They couldn't ignore it. They needed to investigate, no matter the cost. She gave the order to change course and head for the relay station. The journey felt longer than it should have. The deep silence of space wrapped around them, a reminder of how far they were from civilization. Ilara kept her thoughts on the mission, trying to push aside the rising unease that gnawed at the back of her mind. But it didn't help. The weight of history loomed over the Endurance as they approached the coordinates. When the station finally came into view, Ilara felt a chill run down her spine. The once proud relay station now appeared as little more than a decaying husk, its massive metal spires reaching up like skeletal fingers against the vast expanse of stars. The station had been silent for decades, its systems long since deactivated. The area surrounding it was littered with remnants of ships, human and alien alike, destroyed during the final battles of the Broken War. It was a graveyard, silent and forgotten, save for the faint, rhythmic pulse of the distress signal. Ilara gave the order to dock, her voice tight as she tried to maintain control over the growing tension. "Prepare a team for an EVA," she instructed. "We're boarding the station." Her crew was hesitant but compliant. Ilara had led them through tough missions before, but this felt different. They had no idea what they were walking into, and that uncertainty weighed heavily on them all. As the airlock sealed and the Endurance remained in orbit, Ilara and a small team suited up and made their way into the cold, dark depths of the relay station. The door hissed open, and a wave of stale air hit them. The station was eerily quiet. The crew moved cautiously, weapons drawn and senses alert. The flickering emergency lights cast long shadows across the walls, revealing signs of long-abandoned maintenance. What the hell happened here? Lieutenant Hale muttered under his breath, scanning the surroundings. The place looked abandoned, no signs of life. But then, as they moved deeper into the station, they saw it, a line of soldiers. They were standing rigidly in place, as if frozen mid-movement, their eyes staring straight ahead. The sight was unnerving. Their armor was battered, their faces obscured by faceplates, but there was something about their stillness that sent a shiver down Ilara's spine. "Ilara, what is this?" Sergeant Lena Torres whispered, her voice shaky. "I don't know," Ilara replied, her heart racing. Stay sharp." As they moved closer to the soldiers, a faint sound echoed through the air. A whisper, barely audible, yet unmistakable. "Help us. Remember us." The voice was raw, desperate. Ilara froze. The voice had sounded human. Her breath caught in her throat as she slowly advanced. "Captain, I don't think they're dead," Marcus said, his voice laced with disbelief. "They're alive. Somehow." Ilara reached out cautiously, her hand trembling as she touched one of the soldier's shoulders. The soldier's eyes snapped open, glowing with an unnatural light, and Ilara recoiled in shock. The others around her began to stir as well, their movements jerky and slow, as if they were awakening from a long slumber. The air around them crackled with an unseen energy, and the soldiers, despite their eerie stillness, began to radiate an unsettling presence. One soldier's lips parted. "We never left," he whispered, his voice gravelly, but filled with an unmistakable sorrow. Ilara's blood ran cold. She felt something stir within her, a sense of dread that she couldn't shake. What had they found here? And why were these soldiers still here? Before she could ask more questions, the relay station's systems powered up, and the distress signal blared louder, as if calling them forward. The eerie silence of the relay station pressed in on Ilara, as she and her crew stood motionless in front of the soldiers. The figures in battle-worn armor did not speak again, but their presence was heavy, suffocating even. Ilara's hand hovered over her pulse monitor as the team remained frozen in place, unsure whether to advance or retreat. The hum of the station's ancient systems filled the air, now that the distress signal had intensified. The soldiers' eyes continued to glow faintly, watching them, their expressions unreadable behind cracked visors. Ilara's voice was steady, but the uncertainty lingered in the air. "Lieutenant Hale, do a scan. I want to know what we're dealing with here." Hale nodded and activated his handheld device, sweeping it over the figures. His brow furrowed as his readings didn't match anything in their systems. "Captain, this is impossible. There's no life signs detected, no biological presence, but they're still emitting some kind of low-level energy, almost like a neural signature, like they're alive, but not." His voice faltered. "This doesn't make sense." "We need to get a closer look," Ilara said, though her gut screamed to turn back. Despite her unease, she motioned for her team to advance. They moved slowly, deliberately, as though disturbing the silence might bring about something worse. As Ilara approached the nearest soldier, she felt an unsettling tingle along her spine, the hair on the back of her neck standing up. The soldier's armor was dented, scorched from battle, and the insignia was half erased, an old human military emblem, though worn and forgotten by most. The soldier's helmet had a large crack running down the front, but no face peered through. Just a cold, empty void. Ilara reached out, her fingers brushing the cold metal of the armor. The soldier's body shifted ever so slightly at her touch. Her pulse quickened. "Captain, we should really back up," Sergeant Torres said in a low, anxious whisper. "This doesn't feel right." "I know," Ilara replied, her voice tight. "But we need to understand. We need to know what happened to them." Suddenly, a voice broke the silence. It was a guttural rasp, like a breath too long held. "We never left." Ilara recoiled slightly, her heart hammering in her chest. The voice wasn't coming from the soldiers. It was emanating from the walls themselves, the very station, as though it was part of the structure, a whisper that seemed to crawl under her skin. Who are you?" Ilara asked, her voice betraying the fear she was trying to hide. The soldiers around her suddenly twitched, their eyes snapping to life. Ilara stepped back, instinctively reaching for her sidearm. But the soldier closest to her raised a gauntleted hand, signaling for her to stay. "I'm not dead," one soldier rasped, his voice shaking with what could have been desperation. His visor flickered with static, revealing a ghost of a human face. "We were left behind." Ilara's stomach churned. This wasn't just a ghost story or a malfunctioning machine. These were people, real soldiers who had been abandoned, trapped in time, lost in some form of unending limbo. The soldier's lips moved again, the words slow and deliberate. Fate betrayed us. The others seemed to speak in unison, their voices overlapping in a dissonant, broken harmony. Betrayed by the ones who sent us to die, left to fight, alone. Ilara couldn't process what she was hearing. "Who did this to you?" she demanded, feeling the weight of their words pressing in on her. The soldier took a step forward, his movements jerky, unnatural, and yet filled with a strange resolve. "You must remember." He raised his hand, and the faintest glow emanated from his armored palm. It felt like the station itself was pulsing with energy, as though it were alive. Suddenly, the entire room trembled. "Ilara, we need to get out of here. Now." Marcus's voice came over her calm, panic lacing his words. Before she could respond, the ground beneath them began to vibrate violently, throwing them off balance. The soldiers didn't move. They remained perfectly still, as if they were completely unaware of the chaos around them. But the station was no longer dormant. It was awakening. The distress signal blared louder, now amplified, a shrieking, high-pitched wail that seemed to rattle the bones. "Move out, everyone," Ilara ordered, her command cutting through the confusion. She didn't know what was happening, but she could feel it. The station, these soldiers, they were connected. Something was happening that was far beyond what they could comprehend. As the team turned to flee, a voice boomed across the station's comm system, echoing through every corridor. "We are Legion." Ilara's heart pounded in her chest. There was no escaping this now. They had awakened something ancient, something that had been lying dormant for centuries. The soldiers' words, Legion, had never sounded more terrifying. As Ilara and her team sprinted back toward the airlock, the full weight of the situation crashed down on her. The soldiers weren't just remnants of a forgotten war. They were waiting for something. For justice. For vengeance. And now, they were awake. And they would not rest until they had what they were owed. Ilara's heart raced as she and her crew made their way back to the Endurance. The station's tremors were relentless, and the blaring distress signal seemed to grow louder with each passing second, vibrating through the hull of their ship. Once they were safely aboard, the crew scrambled to secure the airlock, and Ilara collapsed into her captain's chair, trying to process the chaos they had just witnessed. "Captain, the soldiers, they're still on the station. The system is too unstable to keep them contained. It's like the station is fighting us now," Marcus said, his voice tight with apprehension. His fingers danced over the controls as he watched the station's power levels fluctuate on his screen. "I don't think we can just leave. Not like this." Ilara rubbed her temples, the overwhelming pressure of the situation making it hard to think clearly. There had to be an explanation for all of this, some way to make sense of what they'd seen. The soldiers, abandoned and trapped in that haunting stasis, had been left behind by humanity itself. The words they had spoken, betrayed, alone, echoed in her mind like a terrible omen. "We need answers," Ilara said, her voice quiet but firm. "We need to know what happened to them. Who did this?" Linatoris, who had been silently staring at the star-filled void outside the viewport, spoke up. "Whatever this is, it's tied to the war. To something deeper. These soldiers weren't just abandoned, Captain. They were sacrificed, left behind to die while the rest of humanity moved on." Ilara's pulse quickened as the pieces began to fall into place. "The broken war," she whispered. "The war that nearly destroyed us. We lost so many. And the government." She trailed off, a sudden, horrifying thought hitting her. What if they didn't just lose? What if they decided to leave them? Lena's face went pale. "You think our own people betrayed them? We need to find out," Ilara said decisively. She tapped her comm link. "Hale, get to the archives. I need everything on the war. Anything related to the Iridian crater sector. Whatever it is, it's connected to that battlefield. Find it. Marcus acknowledged the order, but Ilara could see the unease in his eyes. Whatever he uncovered, he knew it wouldn't be pretty. It wasn't long before Marcus returned, his face grim. "Captain, I found something. It's not much, but it's enough." He pulled up a series of classified files, long buried in the archives. The documents spoke of an agreement, one made during the final stages of the Broken War, when humanity was on the brink of collapse. The Iridian crater had been the site of a major offensive, one that had ended in disaster. But buried deep in the military records, under layers of redacted files, was a single phrase: the legacy of the Forsaken Battalion. Ilara's eyes narrowed. "Forsaken Battalion," she repeated. "Who were they?" "They were a group of elite soldiers," Marcus said. "Volunteers. The best of the best. They were sent into Iridian Crater to secure a key position, but the mission was a trap. They were sacrificed to buy time for the rest of the fleet to retreat. The soldiers were told they would be rescued, but they never were. They were abandoned, left to die." Lena leaned forward. "And they were left behind, just like that." Marcus nodded. "Worse. The higher-ups decided it would be more efficient to use alien technology to harvest the soldiers' skills and memories. They were changed. Their bodies, most of them, died, but their minds, their spirits, they were kept alive, locked in a never-ending cycle of battle. The Forsaken Battalion became something else." Ilara felt the blood drain from her face. "And the soldiers we found, they're part of this." Marcus didn't answer immediately. He pulled up another file, one that was even more heavily redacted. "It gets worse. The technology they used to bind the soldiers' spirits to their bodies. It wasn't just some alien technology. It was a weapon created in secret by humans. The Forsaken Battalion was part of a project, an experiment, and the betrayal was not just from the government. It was a military decision. These soldiers were expendable, treated as little more than tools for war." Ilara sat back in her chair, her head spinning. The truth was far more sinister than she had imagined. The soldiers they had encountered on the station were victims of a betrayal so deep that it had torn apart their very souls. They had been sacrificed, their bodies left to rot, while their consciousnesses were trapped in a never-ending cycle of violence and death. And now, after all these years, they were awake again. Not just alive, but angry. The distress signal had been their cry for help. They hadn't been calling for rescue. They had been calling for justice. Ilara felt a deep, painful sense of guilt settle in her chest. The soldiers had been used, discarded, and forgotten. Their bodies and minds had been shattered, and their souls bound to a fate worse than death. But the galaxy had moved on. Humanity had buried the truth, and now it was rising to the surface, demanding to be heard. "We need to stop this," Ilara said, her voice barely more than a whisper. Lena nodded. "But how? We're not just fighting a group of angry soldiers. We're fighting an entire system that's responsible for this. Whoever did this, whoever gave the orders to leave them behind, they'll stop at nothing to make sure the truth stays buried." The weight of their situation settled in. There was no easy way out now. The soldiers were awake, and they wouldn't stop until they had their vengeance. But neither would Ilara. She had already made a vow to herself. She would see this through. She would uncover the truth, and she would make sure it was known, even if it meant going up against the very people who had betrayed them. The tension in the Endurance's command center was suffocating. Ilara's hands clenched into fists at her sides as she absorbed the magnitude of Marcus's revelations. The Forsaken Battalion, elite soldiers abandoned and transformed into something else, something unnatural, something that no one had ever meant to survive. Lena's voice cut through the heavy silence. "So what happens now? We can't just leave them like this, Captain. Not after everything we've learned." Ilara turned toward the viewport, staring at the dark expanse of space. The stars seemed distant, cold. The reality of what they were facing was sinking in like a slow-moving tide. The Forsaken Battalion wasn't just a lost cause. They were a ticking time bomb, their spirits bound to an existence of torment and rage. And they wouldn't stop until they had their vengeance. "We finish what we started," Ilara said firmly. "We're going back." The Endurance turned back toward the Iridian crater sector, its engines humming with purpose. The crew was tense, knowing that they were walking into the heart of a forgotten war, a war that had been buried and erased from history. They didn't know what they would find on that station, whether the ghost soldiers would welcome them or attack, whether they would uncover more twisted secrets, or whether they would be forced to fight to the death. "What's the plan, Captain?" Marcus asked, pulling up the data from their earlier scans. "We need to understand the technology that's keeping them alive," Ilara said. "If we can destroy it, we can free them. But we have to find out where it is and how it works first." Sergeant Torres spoke up, her voice laced with skepticism. "Destroy it? Captain, these soldiers aren't just trapped in some experiment. They're furious. They've been left to rot for decades, and now they've got a taste of freedom again. What if they turn on us? What if we're the ones who get sacrificed this time?" Ilara's expression hardened. "We have no choice, Lena. If we don't stop this, they'll keep coming, keep hunting. For us, for anyone who gets in their way." Lena fell silent, the weight of Ilara's words settling in. The Endurance came out of warp, and the Iridian crater loomed before them. The relay station was visible in the distance, an eerie silhouette against the backdrop of the stars. The station's once pristine surface was now marred by countless impacts, scorched from battles long past. The soldiers, trapped in their own personal hell, still lingered within, but now they were more than just shadows. They were a threat. As Ilara and her crew approached the station, she couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. The soldiers, no, the Legion. We're out there, somewhere, waiting. She had no illusions about what they might do if they found them. "Stay alert," Ilara ordered. "We move in fast. We don't have time to waste." The Endurance docked with the station, and Ilara led the way as her team suited up for another EVA. The atmosphere inside the station was cold, stale. The faint hum of the ancient systems was the only sound, punctuated by the occasional screech of metal as the station settled further into decay. The soldiers were waiting. They didn't speak this time. They didn't need to. Their eyes glowed dimly, just enough to pierce the darkness of the station's corridors. Ilara and her team moved cautiously, their boots echoing through the long abandoned halls. They had to find the source of the power that was keeping the soldiers alive. "Captain," Marcus's voice crackled through the comms. "I'm seeing something. There's a central hub on this level. It's shielded, but I'm picking up a faint signal. It might be the control center." Ilara nodded. "Lead the way." They moved deeper into the station, passing by more of the silent soldiers. Some of them had shifted positions, their movements jerky, like mechanical puppets straining against invisible strings. Others were still, staring blankly ahead, but they all watched. Then, they reached the hub. It was a vast chamber, its walls lined with alien machinery and human-made devices, a fusion of technology long since lost to the archives. The central console stood in the middle of the room, bathed in an eerie green glow. It hummed with power, a low, menacing sound that vibrated in Ilara's bones. "That's it," Marcus said, his voice tight with apprehension. "That's where the power's coming from." But as they approached, the air grew heavier. The soldiers were closing in. Ilara's pulse quickened. She could feel it now. This place, this power, it wasn't just holding the soldiers in place. It was calling to them, drawing them closer, giving them the strength to rise. "Whatever happens," Ilara said, her voice steady despite the mounting fear, "we stick together. No one gets left behind." But as she spoke those words, she knew the truth. They were already surrounded, and the soldiers were no longer waiting. They were coming. Ilara's breath came in shallow gasps as the soldiers closed in, their cold, empty eyes fixed on her team. The air felt thick, charged with something far worse than just static or the hum of malfunctioning tech. It was as if the very station had come alive, its ancient systems thrumming with purpose, amplifying the rage of the soldiers. They weren't just warriors anymore. They were part of something bigger, something that refused to let them die, even in death. "We can't fight them all," Lena shouted, her rifle aimed at the closest soldier. But the soldiers were already too close, their steps synchronized, echoing with every movement they made. "We don't have to fight them," Ilara said, her voice cutting through the chaos. "We need to shut down the power. Now. If we don't, we're all dead." Marcus, who had been working at the control console, glanced up, his face pale with panic. "It's not that simple, Captain. This system, it's embedded. The soldiers' minds are part of it. The longer we wait, the harder it'll be to disconnect them." Ilara's mind raced. The longer they stayed here, the deeper they became entangled with the station. She could feel it now. The station's will, its hunger. And the soldiers weren't just its soldiers anymore. They were its instruments. They had no personal vendetta. They were simply following orders from something far more ancient than them, something that wanted vengeance and had the power to make it happen. The soldiers raised their weapons, and Ilara didn't hesitate. She fired. The first soldier staggered back, but it didn't fall. Its armor absorbed the blast, the rounds ricocheting off its plated surface, harmless. Ilara's heart raced. These weren't normal soldiers, not anymore. Whatever they had become, they were stronger, faster, and deadlier than any human force. They were like machines, and the station was their fuel. "Get back," Ilara shouted as the soldiers charged. Lena threw a grenade, but the soldier dodged it effortlessly. Ilara's pulse pounded in her ears as the grenade exploded in a burst of light, scattering debris, but the soldiers barely flinched. The explosion didn't even slow them down. "We need a plan," Marcus shouted, backing up toward the far side of the room. "The system's adapting too fast. I can't shut it down while they're in the network." Ilara's mind worked feverishly. The soldiers weren't acting on their own instincts. They were being guided, driven. And that guidance was coming from the station. If she could disrupt that connection, she might be able to stop them. But the question was, how? Then, a flicker of realization struck her. The soldiers were connected to the station's neural network, feeding off its power, using it to fuel their unrelenting rage. The station wasn't just a piece of machinery. It was a mind, a consciousness, and if she could sever that link, even temporarily, she might stand a chance. "Marcus, we need to isolate the soldiers from the station's mainframe," Ilara shouted, her voice fierce. "Find a way to sever the neural connection. Now." Marcus's fingers flew across the console, sweat dripping from his forehead. "I don't know if I can do it, Captain. This isn't just human tech. It's alien. The connections are too complex." Ilara's eyes burned with determination. "You can do it, Marcus. Just think about it. You've always been able to adapt. The system is built on a core framework. Break it. Disable their access to the station's systems." Behind her, Lena fired again, her shot still unable to break through the soldiers' armor. The soldiers were drawing closer, and it was clear they wouldn't stop. The room was growing smaller with each advancing step. Marcus's voice trembled, but he didn't stop working. "If I do this, there's a chance we'll overload the system. It could backfire, Captain. We might not get out of here in one piece. It's better than waiting for them to kill us," Ilara snapped. "Do it." Marcus hesitated only a moment before hitting the final key. The console hummed louder, and the energy in the room shifted, the walls vibrating with intensity. The soldiers froze in place, their weapons still raised, but something was happening. "Come on," Lena muttered under her breath, her eyes darting around the room as if looking for an escape. The air felt thick with anticipation. "Do something, Marcus." The room went silent for a split second. Then the station's systems groaned, and the soldiers' eyes flickered, a brief moment of confusion washing over them. "They're disconnecting," Marcus said, his voice low. "I've isolated their neural link. They're no longer receiving the signal from the mainframe." Ilara let out a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. The soldiers wavered for a moment, their movements sluggish and uncoordinated. But Ilara knew that this wouldn't last long. They had just given themselves a few precious seconds to act, and they needed to move fast. "Lena, take the left flank," Ilara ordered. "Marcus, stay on that console. I'll try to hold them off." But the moment she moved toward the advancing soldiers, a blast rang out. One of the soldiers, now moving erratically, as if in pain, fired at her. Ilara ducked, narrowly avoiding the blast, but the force knocked her back into the control panel. The room flashed with violent light as the soldiers tried to regroup. Ilara's mind was racing. They had managed to sever their connection, but it wouldn't be long before they adapted to the change. The station was too powerful, too entrenched. "We don't have much time," she said through gritted teeth. "We have to end this now." The soldiers staggered, their movements sluggish as the connection to the station's central system was severed. But the relief was short-lived. The momentary lull in their aggressive advance was deceiving. The station, though temporarily disrupted, was far from powerless. Even without the soldiers' neural link, it still controlled the environment, and it was adapting faster than Ilara could process. Ilara rolled to the side, narrowly avoiding another blast from the nearest soldier. The concussion from the explosion had sent debris skittering across the floor, creating a dangerous obstacle course between her and the station's central core. The remaining soldiers slowly regained their composure, their eerie, synchronized movements falling back into place, but now with a renewed sense of purpose. "Get to the core," Ilara shouted, pulling herself up from the floor, a sting of pain shooting through her side. "We need to finish this now." Lena and Hale moved to the left, flanking the soldiers as they advanced, guns raised, ready to fire. But the soldiers were adapting, their armored bodies moving in a perfect formation, efficiently absorbing the incoming fire with the strength of a machine. The sheer precision of their movements made it clear that they weren't just fighting. They were designed to win. Lena fired a series of quick shots, but it was useless. The soldiers didn't break formation, and the rounds just bounced off their reinforced plating. Hale was equally ineffective, his shots a blur against the relentless wall of enemy soldiers. "We're running out of options," Hale shouted, ducking behind cover as another soldier's blast sent a piece of debris flying past him. Ilara didn't answer right away. She was still watching the soldiers, trying to read their movements, trying to anticipate their next attack. They were a living nightmare, more machine than man, but with the rage and fury of 1,000 men. Their minds were no longer human. They were part of something far worse. The station itself had become their god, their purpose, and its thirst for vengeance was insatiable. "We need to destroy the core," Marcus called from behind the console, his voice tight with urgency. "If we don't do this now, the whole station's going to reinitialize. They'll be back to full power. The Legion will never stop." Ilara nodded, knowing Marcus was right. Every second they wasted, the soldiers were recovering. The station was rebuilding itself, and the danger was escalating. The soldiers had no mercy, no hesitation. They would hunt them down until they were nothing but dust. "Cover me," Ilara ordered, her voice steady despite the chaos around her. With no time to waste, Ilara sprinted toward the center of the room, ducking behind pieces of scattered debris as she made her way closer to the control panel. The soldiers were too busy focusing on Lena and Hale, who were doing their best to keep the advancing battalion at bay. But Ilara knew it wouldn't last. They had to disable the core, quickly, or they were all dead. She reached the control console, her breath coming in ragged gasps. The core was exposed, its glowing interior pulsating like a heartbeat. The alien and human technology fused together in a nightmarish dance, each piece working in tandem to power the soldiers and the station alike. But the longer Ilara stared at it, the more she realized something. This wasn't just a control panel. It was a conduit, a way to feed the Legion energy, to fuel their rage, to keep them alive. Ilara's hands flew over the panel, her fingers moving as though guided by instinct. She knew what she had to do. Marcus had mentioned the system was based on a core framework. That meant there was a way in, a way to overload it, to shut it down for good. Captain, Marcus's voice crackled through her comm. You need to destabilize the core. Overload it. Now. Ilara didn't hesitate. She pushed every lever, pressed every button, overrode every system as fast as she could. The lights in the room flickered erratically, and the soldiers turned, sensing the disruption. They were closing in on her fast, too fast. Lena, hail. Now. Ilara shouted, her hand shaking as she pulled the final lever. Behind her, Lena and Hale were providing cover fire, but their ammunition was limited. They were exhausted, desperate. And the soldiers were only getting stronger, quicker. Hold them off for just a few more seconds. Ilara's voice was tight, fear creeping in despite her resolve. She could feel the temperature rising in the room, the hum of the station growing louder, more unstable. The core was beginning to destabilize, but the process was slow, too slow. One of the soldiers lunged forward, its bladed arm outstretched. Ilara barely had time to raise her sidearm, firing blindly as she dove to the side. The blast hit the soldier in the chest, but it barely seemed to register. The soldier was closing in. Lena screamed, throwing herself into the line of fire as she tackled the soldier to the ground. The soldier's helmet cracked under the impact, but it didn't slow it down. It kept fighting, and Lena barely had time to roll out of the way before another soldier took her place. Hale gritted his teeth, desperately reloading his weapon. Captain, we need to move now. The core groaned as Ilara made her final move. She hit the overload button with every ounce of strength left in her body. The station's systems erupted in a violent surge of power. Sparks flew from the walls, and the soldiers faltered, their movements jerky and uncoordinated as their link to the core was severed. The station began to shake violently. Lights exploded in flashes of blinding light, and the ground trembled beneath them as the core began to destabilize. Ilara knew it was too late to escape, but there was one last chance. Run, she screamed. The explosion came seconds later. The explosion that ripped through the station was like the scream of a dying beast. The world around Ilara and her team shattered in an instant. Walls crumbled, lights flickered and burned out, and the floor beneath them trembled as if the entire station was collapsing into itself. The ground buckled, throwing them off their feet, and the roar of crumbling metal filled the air. Ilara's body slammed against the jagged edge of the control console. Her vision swam, her ears ringing with the aftershock of the explosion. She could barely make out the shape of Lena, pinned under a piece of fallen debris, her body limp but her hands still twitching, clutching a rifle. Ilara. Marcus's voice cut through the chaos, faint and distant. We need to get out of here. Now. Shaking off the disorienting fog in her mind, Ilara pushed herself to her knees. She gasped for breath, her chest tight. The air was thick with smoke and the acrid scent of burning circuitry. For a moment, she couldn't hear anything, just the pounding of her heart in her ears. Lena. Ilara called, her voice hoarse. Lena didn't respond. Panic shot through Ilara as she scrambled over the debris, her movements jerky, desperate. She finally reached Lena, her heart in her throat. But when she checked for a pulse, Lena's chest rose and fell with slow, shallow breaths. She was alive, barely. We've got to move, Ilara said urgently, grabbing Lena's shoulder to pull her up. But Lena's hand shot out, gripping her wrist tightly. No, Lena rasped, her voice barely audible. It's too late. We can't outrun this. Ilara's breath caught in her throat. The sound of the station's collapse was overwhelming, and the tremors underfoot were only growing stronger. She could hear the distinct, ominous hum of the core's detonation, the countdown for something far worse than just an explosion. It wasn't just the station falling apart. It was the beginning of something else. The Legion's last stand. Ilara, the soldiers. Marcus began, but his voice was cut off by another deafening crack from the walls. The room lurched violently. Ilara barely had time to stabilize herself, but Marcus's warning rang in her mind. The Legion wasn't dead. Not yet. The soldiers might have been disconnected from the station's power, but they were still an unstoppable force. The destruction of the core had only made them more unstable, more chaotic. There was no telling what would happen when the system finally collapsed completely. Marcus, Ilara shouted. Get Lena to safety. I'll hold them off. No, Marcus's voice cracked with fear. We can't fight them anymore, Ilara. They'll come for us. We need to get out of here before. Another violent tremor ripped through the room, and a large chunk of the ceiling broke free, crashing down toward them. Ilara dived toward Lena, shoving her out of the way just in time. The debris crushed the ground where they had been standing, leaving a massive dent in the floor. The dust settled slowly, but the sound of movement, heavy, deliberate footsteps, was unmistakable. The soldiers, they were still alive, still coming. The core may have been destabilized, but the Legion had no intention of letting them escape. Lena gritted her teeth as Ilara helped her to her feet, the weight of the situation sinking in. We're not getting out of here, are we? Lena asked, her voice thick with exhaustion. Ilara didn't answer. She couldn't. The station was collapsing, but the soldiers weren't stopping. They were emerging from the smoke and shadows, their glowing eyes piercing through the wreckage. Their movements were erratic, disjointed, but their intent was unmistakable. Get to the escape pods, Ilara ordered. Now. Lena nodded, her face pale, and the two of them began to move toward the hall. But Marcus was still struggling to make sense of the situation, his eyes glued to the monitors. Captain, Marcus shouted, you need to see this. Ilara turned, her stomach sinking. Marcus's face was lit by the flickering light of a control panel. The screen showed a series of fluctuating readings, energy surges, system failures, and something else. The soldiers, Marcus said, his voice grim. They're not alone. There are more of them. The station, it's still pulling them from the other sectors. It's reactivating every soldier it can find. The realization hit Ilara like a punch to the gut. They hadn't just been fighting the last remnants of the Forsaken Battalion. The station had been storing soldiers, fragments of the Legion. And now they were being unleashed, awakened by the station's last gasp of life. Ilara's heart raced. They didn't have the time to fight an army. They needed to leave now. But the hall to the escape pods was blocked, the pathway choked with debris from the collapsing structure. We don't have time to waste. Ilara shouted. Move. With the station groaning around them, the soldiers closing in, and the core's imminent collapse making every second feel like an eternity, Ilara pushed them all forward, the weight of failure hanging heavily in the air. She had failed to destroy the Legion completely. It had been too ingrained in the station, too tightly woven into its systems. There would be no peaceful escape. Run, Ilara screamed, knowing that even if they made it to the pods, they were still in the hands of the dead. The echo of the soldiers' footsteps grew louder as Ilara, Lena, and Marcus sprinted toward the last hope of survival. An escape that might already be too late. The escape pods were only a few corridors away, but to Ilara, they felt like an eternity. The station groaned with the weight of its collapse, its systems screaming as the walls buckled and twisted. Dust choked the air, and the flickering emergency lights painted everything in a sickly red hue. The floor beneath them shook with each new explosion, each tremor of the dying beast. Lena stumbled, her leg giving out from the pain of the debris collision. Ilara didn't hesitate. She grabbed her, hoisting her up even as her own body screamed in protest. Marcus was ahead, his face pale and taut, his eyes locked on the path ahead as he typed frantically on his portable console, desperately trying to bring up the escape pod systems. "We're almost there," Marcus shouted over his shoulder, but his voice was barely audible over the sound of the station falling apart. Behind them, the soldiers were closing in. Ilara didn't have to look to know they were there. She could feel them, the weight of their relentless pursuit pressing on her like a vice. They were dead, but they weren't gone. Their minds were still bound to the station, to its core, still bent on ensuring their destruction. "We need to move faster," Lena gasped, blood staining her shirt from the injuries she'd sustained. But there was no time for rest, no time for hesitation. Ilara pushed forward, barely noticing the jagged debris that scraped her skin as she sprinted. Her pulse pounded in her ears, the thundering beat of her heart matching the tremors of the station. The escape pods were their only hope. If they didn't get to them, they would die here. But if they did get to them, would they be able to survive the explosion that was sure to come? The station wasn't just collapsing. It was self-destructing. As they rounded the final corner, Marcus stopped dead in his tracks, his breath coming in ragged gasps. The door to the escape pod bay was sealed. Locked. Damn it. Marcus slammed his fist against the control panel, but the door didn't budge. His face was twisted in frustration and panic. "Ilara, do something," Lena cried, her voice strained. Ilara didn't waste time asking questions. She was already at Marcus's side, yanking at the panel and working through the emergency overrides. The soldiers were closer now. She could hear their footsteps echoing down the hallway, their mechanical bodies moving with an eerie precision. The sound of their footsteps grew louder, faster. "We don't have time. Ilara, please," Lena urged, tears streaking down her dirt-covered face. Ilara didn't have an answer. She was running out of time, and she knew it. With one final push, she activated the emergency release override. The door groaned, its mechanisms fighting against the damage. But with a final shudder, it opened just enough for them to squeeze through. The escape pods were in sight, but they weren't alone. The soldiers poured into the bay, their faces twisted in rage, their bodies broken but still moving with deadly intent. The first one fired without warning, a blast that sent debris flying and forced the team to take cover. "Go, get to the pods," Ilara shouted, her heart racing as she drew her sidearm and fired, forcing the soldiers to scatter. But it was a losing battle. Every shot was a waste of time. They weren't going to stop. Lena was already moving, her hand gripping the pod's control panel, trying to override the pod's lockdown system. Marcus had already bolted toward the nearest pod, his fingers flying over the console. Ilara turned back to face the incoming soldiers, her breathing shallow. She couldn't let them reach the others. They needed every second she could buy. "Ilara, move," Lena screamed, her voice sharp with panic. The soldiers were almost on top of her now, their weapons raised. But just as they closed in, something shifted in the station's core, a final, explosive release of energy that rocked the walls with a deafening roar. It was as if the entire station was screaming in agony, and in that moment, everything froze. The soldiers, their bodies locked in place, turned toward the epicenter of the explosion. The blast hit with such force that it sent shockwaves through the station. Ilara barely had time to react as the floor beneath her cracked and buckled. The explosion sent debris flying in every direction. The pod bay doors, weakened by the blast, finally gave way. One of the pods shot open just as Ilara dove for cover. She made it, barely. But the station wasn't done yet. The entire structure was disintegrating now, the air alive with static. She had only moments before the final explosion would consume everything in its path. "Ilara." Marcus's voice came through the comm, strained but urgent. "We've got the pod open, but we need to go now." Without a second thought, Ilara staggered toward the pod, clutching Lena's arm and pulling her along as they scrambled inside. The door slammed shut behind them, locking them in as the countdown to launch began. The shaking grew more violent. The station was in its death throes, and the soldiers, their reanimated bodies, were nothing more than shattered remnants of a war long forgotten. "We're going to make it," Lena whispered, her face pale but hopeful. Ilara didn't answer. She couldn't. As the pod's thrusters ignited, sending them hurtling away from the station's dying carcass, she watched the fiery remains of the station consume itself in the distance. The explosion sent a shockwave rippling through space, a violent flash of light that briefly blotted out the stars. And then silence. The station was gone. The Legion was gone. But at what cost? Ilara leaned back in her seat, her body bruised, her heart heavy. They had escaped, yes, but the war wasn't over. The question still remained. What had truly caused the station to break down? What other fragments of the Legion were out there, waiting to rise again? She didn't know. But as the stars stretched out before them, Ilara knew one thing for certain. Humanity's fight was far from over, and the ghost soldiers of a broken war would never be truly gone.